Hey folks, welcome back. Today we're doing another resume review for Kelly, who submitted her resume. And this is actually a first for this channel. I've been helping students with their resumes for a few years now, but I've actually never helped a 3D artist. We've worked with designers' resumes, programmers' resumes. We've seen almost all on this channel. However, I actually haven't focused on this, and it's mostly because I don't have a lot of experience in creating 3D art. However, I was very fortunate to work with some of the best 3D artists in the world. I reached out to somebody at my company, Activision Blizzard, and while he or she did not want to do the interview live with me, they actually sat down with me, and for over an hour we poured through Kelly's work. Really, he or she, I'll use a male pronoun, let's say, but this person, let's call them Sam. Well, he really helped me understand a lot of what a reviewer, a critique person looks for in the art, and what elevates the art from maybe being entry, associate level, junior level to mid level, and then what we would expect from an expert's art. So there's a lot to dive in here, not just for artists who are working on their portfolios, but other people as well who might just want to appreciate the craft. And we're going to start from the resume itself. Kelly's got a beautiful resume here. I love it. Nice, simple, really, strong statements with the different sections here. Nice little line there. It's lovely, and the green is just beautiful. Adds a splash of color. I'm always trying to get applicants to add a splash of color to their resumes, certainly for artists, because that is going to be expected of you to make things look sexy and make them look good. And let's just face it, folks. When everybody else has a black and white resume, you want to be colorful, man. You want to stick out. You want to be fun. I would say don't need the phone number. Really, anything you don't feel comfortable publicly sharing on a megaphone in the middle of Times Square, probably not good to have there. But I think, having the email and the link to the ArtStation is great too. Now, I've seen a lot of artists, programmers as well, use external websites for their portfolio, right? So you might make a portfolio on Wix or Weebly or GoDaddy, Blogspot, whatever the heck, right? Or you might use one of these third-party vendors, right? You might use an ArtStation for artists, or programmers, for example, might link their GitHub. All of that is fine, whatever you prefer. And so Sam, when he was reviewing this page, he read through this a little bit, was looking at some of the program skills. There was one that stood out to him, actually. He was intrigued by the Arnold renderer. I'm not familiar with Arnold Render, but he said that this was something that's a little bit more technologically advanced, and so that impressed him, so he was happy to see that. I think if there's anything that you're trying to achieve here with the program skills, and I'm happy she didn't, rate them. That's something I see candidates sometimes do. They'll give themselves 1 out of 5 stars or something silly like that. Instead, she's just listing them here, which is exactly what you should do to show the breadth that you have as an applicant and some of the tool sets you might be familiar with. So she did a fantastic job there. And I actually really loved the descriptions of some of the work here. So, for example, when she's talking about the souls within the catacombs piece, which we will look at soon, she talked a little bit about her process here. However, Sam actually didn't get to read that because while she detailed her process here in the resume, it's not detailed in the ArtStation. And the artist who's reviewing your work is obviously just going to click right through. They're going to want to see the visuals. And so that was a real missed opportunity, I think, because he often mentioned when we were looking at the ArtStation, oh man, I wish you would have shared her process or better explained what the motivation was behind this piece, what the context was behind this piece, what she was thinking about, all that stuff, right? And I actually feel like a lot of those questions are being answered in the descriptions here, but they're not included in the ArtStation pieces. So I would have really preferred if you could just replicate whatever the description you're putting here, it should be beside the piece itself. So that would be one small note there. But overall, I think it's a really solid entrance. It's a really solid start and invitation to the portfolio itself. So let's jump into it. Here we go. Kelly Mclean, 3D environment artist, and I love it already, right? It's such a beautiful layout of the different pieces here, and we've got a nice breadth as well. So I think we're excited about that. So a lot of folks, or at least I wasn't too familiar with what the hierarchy was for artists. So I think I wrote this down at some point, and I say hierarchy, that's probably not the right term. I should instead say something like a career progression that a lot of artists go through. let me see. So I've wrote it down here. So usually, as Sam explained to me, artists will start with designing simple props in set pieces, right? So I guess if you're designing a scene from The Last of Us, you might make the coffee cup over here or something like that. Then you go to constructing a room with composite parts from other artists. So in that case, it might be that the artist you're working with designed the desk, the chair, the chalkboard, and your job in designing the classroom is to put those pieces together within the room. And then from there, the artist, so he called that situating artist props. And then from there, you gain exposure to the different kinds of props that you might be interfacing with. And it's at that point you start to really specialize and find what part of the art you're excited about. And of course, we're talking about hard surface modeling, as I believe what you would call it, rather than soft surface modeling, I guess, which is more like creature design and faces. And I forget what that tool's called, but the one that's like mud. You artists know what I'm talking about, but I can't remember it right now. So we're talking for the hard surface modelers, people who are using stuff like Maya and Houdini and things like that. Well, you could use Houdini for anything these days, right? But those kind of tool sets is what we're talking about here. And now here's the cool thing, right? Just like programmers break into different subgenres of programming, I guess. You've got network programming, gameplay programming, etc. Artists as well specialize. And so this is something that Kelly probably will find herself doing at some point in the future. She'll have to decide what kind of hard surface modeler she wants to be, because there are so many options there. And so some of the ones which he highlighted to me, Sam, were you could be an environment artist, you could be a weapon artist, you could be an item artist, or you can work on some hard surface characters, something similar to maybe this mech robot we have over here. So those different distinctions sort of run the gamut of many different options that a artist can choose to specialize within. And what we see here from Kelly is several pieces in many different directions. Okay, so Kelly, in this case, it doesn't seem like she's exactly focused, lasered in on one particular piece. She has the relative breadth of maybe someone who's new to the industry, experimenting with different topics, and still has to maybe find which one is her calling. At the same time, so that telegraphs two things. At one part, it's like, okay, I'm versatile. But on the other part, it's like, okay, there's, a variety of things that I'm working on and I haven't yet settled on an expertise. So those are some of the things that he was thinking through when he was looking at this for the first moment. Hopefully I don't misquote him, right? So that's basically what he said. So just some ideas here. Right, he's saying basically she'll have to pick one eventually, but this helps show that she's a generalist in some sense. But we're going to jump into what's her first piece, so I would assume it's her premiere piece, and this is, of course, Souls Within the Catacombs. So here she has a little blurb here, but again, we would love to see the more detailed description of all this stuff that you're talking about. Would love to see that here instead, because this is relatively terse. So let's jump into it. What's going on with Souls in the Catacombs? First, I just wanted to take a moment to really appreciate the beautiful artwork which Kelly has here. And if you want to check out more of her work, you can go to her portfolio. But as you can see, this is a dark and gloomy catacomb piece. Of course, inspired by Dark Souls. So we see a comp here. And that's great. He loves that. Sam mentioned particularly, he loves it when people are showing their references and showing sort of what inspired them, any sort of key art. That's really useful because it helps him to understand how you go from, I guess, concept or reference to the final product. And that's really important because some of her later pieces, to the detriment of the portfolio, do not include references or key art. And so it was hard for him to abstract really where the piece was coming from and what context it might be in. So I feel like this was really well done and is actually a template, an example that Kelly could use in her other pieces. Because while she did a great job here, the other pieces falter with that respect of really showing the thought process that led to the designs. Here's the breakout. He loves this stuff, right? For me, I don't understand it as much, right? Obviously, we're looking at tris and polys. But for this stuff, he looked at this page I'm not gonna kid around. I mean, obviously he's explaining it to me, so I'm sure as a professional, if he wasn't explaining it, he'd just skip, through it or do it much faster. But he spent probably half his time looking at this page rather than the final renderings. So there's a lot to talk about here, and we'll discuss that in a moment. Here are the renderings as well, and this sort of, I guess, ambient lighting. And here we have it as well. And I have to say, he had a lot of comments there, right? You're putting this in what appears to be the Unreal Engine. And he said that does a lot of the work for you. So that is good in some ways, right? But obviously it's not going to hide anything from an expert reviewer like him. And so he did mention, that, it looks, obviously this final rendering, it looks beautiful, right? But at the end of the day, the reviewer is going to spend a lot more time looking at something like this, right? Because you can't hide your mistakes in something like this. They're going to be looking very deeply at that. And so here we have some more comparisons of the Dark Souls shot. And I do want to call out one more thing in particular, which is just this one on the bottom where you have the Mclean, I forget what it's called, the little crash dummy from UE4, the default guy, in the space. That is so critical, and it's an important part he hit on. When we think about these spaces, right, they're not just art, right? In game industry, we never make just art. You're always making a game, art for a purpose. And so it's really important to contextualize the piece with respect to how the player is going to experience it. And so some of these establishing shots are cool and useful, and I think they really sell the ambiance. But at the end of the day, what's really important is that you're thinking about the environment from the perspective of a player. So he really appreciated that you included the shot in the bottom here to show what a player would see if they were inside of this world. That's really important, and you did a great job of that. This is something that could have been improved in the other pieces where we don't get the full context of where the piece would be within a game. Awesome. So I just hit some of the highlights. That's the orientation. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty details of what Sam had to say about this piece. Okay, so let's jump into the poly counts looking at this piece, okay? He loved that you included this. This is sort of like showing your work, right, on the math test. In the math exams that I used to take when I was in school, they wouldn't give you full credit if you just wrote the right answer. You had to show the work to prove how you got to that answer. And oftentimes, the work was more important because you could get partial credit and stuff like that, right? It's a similar thing going on here. He's spending a lot of time looking at these poly counts and thinking about it. So here was something he said that really went over my head. But he said Max is a trie-based modeling package. So it's very important to consider the vert counts. I don't quite know exactly what that meant, meaning a trie-based package versus something else. I'm not sure. But what was clear to me was he had a very piqued interest with respect to where detail was placed inside of the scene and where detail was not placed. Of course, making art, you're simplifying the world in a little bit, right? It's a little bit of an abstraction always. And so some places are going to have less detail than others. Some places are going to have more. And so he's thinking about whether or not that detail, that effort was put into the right place. And that's something to always be conscious of, I guess for laymen like me, it's simply questioning how many, how dark is it in certain regions, right? Are there a lot of lines there? Is there a lot of granularity to that part of the piece? And where are they focusing their efforts? So those are some of the comments there. One thing that he particularly said is that he thought, okay, so we have sort of two things happening here. And this was an interesting way that he interpreted the piece. He thought about these roots over here, these branches. He called that organics. And everything else, he didn't have a name for it, but I guess it would just be non-organic materials. And he said that when it comes to making organic materials, you really do want to increase the poly count there. And he was unhappy with the level of detail provided in these roots. In particular, one of the reasons why he was mentioning that is because he thinks it's very important for these organics, particularly as they laid in the scene, which he drew his attention to, which was this thing, like here. He says, you know, the reason why we might want to have very strong detail on those organics is because they're going to show up in the shadows more so than any of the interior walling, obviously. And when you're dealing with a flat wall, there's a lot of tricks that you could do, right, with maps. Right now, I don't know all the terminology here, but bump maps, roughness maps, all that stuff can add a sort of a faux surface texturing to it, I suppose you could say. But you can't lie with the shadows if you don't have the geometry right. And you know, even as someone who's not technically very technical when it comes to art and stuff like that, you can see in the light here, when you really do pay attention to it, some of these roots do look quite queer, not quite organic. They look almost like little, you know, little cones, little points. And so I don't think that really, I think that could have used a greater attention to detail as he explained it, particularly because it is an organic material and because it's going to be showing with the shadows. So I think he would have preferred to see more of the detail there when it comes to the organics versus, I mean, you know, this static stuff looks good, but the organics could use more, is the short and skinny of it. He mentioned that the brick archways look like a good place to have maybe a little bit less detail. So I believe he was referencing these brick archways, and he said that the poly count there may not be actually 100% necessary to have that much detail. Before I forget, one of the other things that he mentioned is when we look at the final rendering of the scene, there's a lot of stuff in this scene that Kelly did not include a work process for, right? So we see grass, we see blood-stained decals, we see a skeleton here, and maybe some cool particle effects. He really would have preferred to show all of your work there. So even if you're just sourcing assets, he wanted to have a list of work cited here. And Kelly doesn't credit any of the other artists for the work that she's using in her piece, and he did not like that. So he would have much preferred, if you're using other people's work integrated within your own, that's perfectly fine, right, to sell the final scene, especially if, you know, you're not designing skeletons or whatever. But he wants you to call out those examples, because otherwise it's hard to tell what did she do versus what did she not do. So he would have liked that. Especially, you know, whether or not you're making these textures and stuff, everything kind of goes up in the air if you're not listing your sources. So you can't tell what the candidate made versus what they didn't make. And that's not a good place to be. Okay, so ultimately, in a single sentence or two, he said that this art struck him as very entry-level and straightforward. Overall, the pieces were rectilinear or rigid in their drawing, and he saw that there was a lot of opportunities here for storytelling which were not seized upon, and so he would have liked a little bit more detail there. And that would get to, I would say, two key takeaways which I've taken from this portfolio review, which I'll summarize now. And I think it's interesting because, in a sense, a lot of these two takeaways can be applied to really any discipline within game development. And they are, the first one is looking for opportunities to tell a story in almost everything we do. And the second is thinking about the bigger picture and how this work is going to be affecting other people and how it will be integrated in ways you don't maybe foresee right now. So the first I would say maybe storytelling, and the second I would call maybe foresight. Storytelling and foresight are really important aspects and of what it means to be a great artist, and seem to be the definitive traits between an entry-level artist and somebody who does have more experience. So let's talk a little bit about those two and how the shortcomings there too may present themselves in this work of art. Okay, so the storytelling. So this is, let's look at this place, right? This is a creepy ass crypt, right? It's been here forever. It's fallen apart for sure, and it's overgrown with vines. So we're looking at as many opportunities as we can to really tell that story. And I think you're going to see here that he was immediately just trying to pick out pieces and see if it was all coherent, right? So for example, we could see that the floor is really askew and even some of the walls are popping out, but that is not too greatly juxtaposed against pixel perfect alignment of the arches, right? So the arches, in other words, look perfect, pristine, brand new, whereas the floor looks like it's been here 100,000 years. And so that's not great. It's not cohesive in that sense. Rectilinear, I think he's talking about the organics a little bit, but he's just talking to the rigidity of the structure. And look at this archway, right? I mean, it looks perfectly straight up, whereas the floor was kind of all askew. And so I feel like maybe like the artist looked at this example flooring and sort of got what they were going for with the tiling, but sort of forgot to apply that to some of the sides. And you can see even in the reference art, they are doing a little bit of that. But I think the reviewer thought that might have been a better opportunity to really mix it up, particularly in the walls here, right? So you see these walls, I mean, they're completely flat, as is the archways and, you know, this section here, and a good deal of the barring. So he liked that this door was a little bit askew, a little bit like it's been pulled off its hinges a bit, but all the other bars are almost perfectly straight. And so he felt like that was a real opportunity for storytelling that was not taken advantage of. In particular, you know, he's thinking about this in terms of kits. And for people who don't know, a kit is sort of like a toolbox. Maybe that's not the right phrase, but it's sort of like a toolbox that an artist can use when they're putting together the game world. And so, in other words, you might have a wall that's yellow, a wall that's red, and a wall that's blue, and you want to construct a world, so you might put some yellow walls here, some blue walls there, some red walls there, kind of make it look interesting and different. Well, that's sort of what's going on here. He has these, or Kelly has created these tiles here, right? So, for example, this is a square, that might be the wall, and then this wall would go next to it, and then maybe another wall next to that one. However, there isn't a lot of variety presented here. I mean, there's only 2 walls. And so he would have really loved to see what a wall might look like if it had more decay. And he explained basically the only constraints there are that the edges of the wall line up. But there's a lot of deformity and artistry that can happen between these bounds. So he would have loved to see if these bricks were jutting out a bit or falling apart. And in particular, he really wanted to see these crypt outlets. I don't know exactly what it would be called, but, or he called them inlets. That's what it is. A crypt inlet being like torn apart. To see a crypt inlet with sort of some of the stones broken on the ground, maybe a little skeleton has crawled out of this. I think there's some really awesome reference art in Skyrim where they have these crypts that are sort of all askew. Some have coffins laying on the ground, and these evil, you know, demons come out of there and, you know, try to fight you. So I think he would have liked to see a lot more of this. At least that's what he expressed. Particularly in the gate. He thinks that's a real opportunity for storytelling. He called that out in particular. Okay, let's see what else he said here. So that's the first thing. We're thinking about opportunities for storytelling. That was the first thing. The second thing was foresight. So he wants to see how is Kelly thinking about how these assets might be used in the future, right? And so I think it's very clear that Kelly set up these pieces for the sake of creating this room. And I feel like that is sort of the basics, right? That's the first step. He wants to see artists, or he would expect to see artists who are more experienced, going above and beyond and thinking not only about how are these assets going to be used in this particular scene, but how are these assets going to be used in other scenes within the game? You know, how are we going to build this out into a more cohesive kit, or at least show that you're thinking about that? So some of the pieces he would have liked to see, as he said, particularly, he would have liked to see variations on the arch, because something like a Dark Souls game would expect a lot more variation. So he wants to see that foresight, basically thinking about it in a kit structure. And, you know, this arch is only going to be good here. And he said, you know, looking at this single room, he's already seeing a lot of repetition in the archways and some of the iconography of this level. So he would have liked to see a lot, to see some I guess, diversity that could be applied. Because if you're going to do this for several rooms, you're certainly going to run into some issues here with it all feeling samey. So with reference to this art, he spoke a little bit about platforms, and I think that is important to talk about what's the expectation there. As I said, this piece, compared to the other pieces in this portfolio, does a pretty good job of explaining the context. We have literal art from another game, right? Dark Souls. So immediately we're thinking this is a platform. This is a game on the console platform, which comes with a certain expectation of detail, because we're going to be viewing this on the PS4 or the PC. And he felt that the detailing present in this portfolio did not hold up to, I guess, the PC or console level, because this level of repetition is a little bit too immature for something like a console. So he said, you know, this would be awesome for maybe a mobile game, but we need to see the level bumped up if we're going to put this on a console, right? So something like this would not be able to ship on a AAA game, given his review. So those are some of the thoughts that he had. Let's see, what else does he say here? Okay, so he says, you know, you're grabbing this stuff from the UE4 marketplace. List where your sources are from. We mentioned that. So he was a little bit disappointed, I think, to not see a little bit more of the work being shown for the lower level detail. In particular, he posed it like this. If you're creating a scene with many different references like this, he wants you to choose a marquee element and go in great detail on that element within your portfolio. In other words, he wants you to pick a piece from this portfolio. He suggested, perhaps in this case, one of the brick tiles on the floor, and talk about your entire process from start to finish of that brick tile on the floor. And by talk, I mean show with your art, show with your work, what it took to get from the beginning stage all the way up to the final rendering that we're seeing here. In particular, he would have liked to see the maps associated with this piece. And again, I don't know all the tech details here. I'm not an artist myself. But he's saying in particular, we would expect to see the defaults, which are terms you may be familiar with, such as, he said, albedo, gloss map, color map, normal map. We want to see everything on the texture substance side of the coin, zoomed in on the marquee. Just one marquee piece needs to be included for that level of detail, not everything, because we don't need all of them, because you're not a surface artist. We just want to know what your skill level is with respect to that. Okay, and she goes into a little bit more detail on some of those mappings in some later pieces within the portfolio, but unfortunately they are unfortunately missing in this case. So he would have loved to see that detail on a marquee piece. Right, so we could rely on the bump mapping and texturing for some of these side walls, but if it's going to silhouette, that's his verb there. If it's going to silhouette, it needs to have that fine level of detail in the organics he's referencing. Of course, these vines on the side, they don't look, I think, as nice as they could, is I think his perspective. He loved the way that she made the bars on the gate look a little bit worn down. He said he wants to see that level of detail and storytelling expanded to all elements of the piece. So he really liked the way that these bars are bent, and he said, you know, you're on the right track. Just keep chasing that. Just keep going down that track, applying that level of storytelling and detail, that little bit of a skewness, that little bit of, oh, this has been here 1,000 years. Add that hint to the rest of the world, and the piece is going to live so much brighter for it. Thinking about debris, so he would have liked to see what debris look like within a crypt inset, or maybe even a collapsed crypt inset. He said his gut read is it's not working for AAA, but it would work for mobile. The repetition is too evident in the example. And I asked him, I thought this might be interesting or useful for you, Kelly, as a way to gauge your work with respect to what he would like to see from an expert or an entry-level person. And he said that for a mid to senior level person, this kit would be under a week of work, maybe 3 days, he said. Another week to texture all of it, and a week then to set it up and start building it out. So maybe 3 weeks in total with those increments. So that is just, I guess, sort of his back of the envelope estimate of what the time expectations would be. And I do always find that's a little bit useful to see how I compare to the experts. Okay, so that completes our research and review of the main piece of this portfolio, which is the catacomb. I think Kelly did an amazing job and shows a lot of attention to detail here in certain parts. And there's a great opportunity to grow here as well if we take that storytelling and extra attention paid to those iron bars and apply it to other pieces as well. Thinking in particular, where do we need the high level of detail and where is it okay to maybe leave less detail? And also, so that's all about storytelling, and it's also the foresight of thinking about how can we expand this kit with another archway, another piece here and there, maybe variations on the side walls in order for this kit to be useful for a AAA game. Okay, so those are some of his thoughts. Let's jump now into the next piece, the mecha in autopilot. All right, let's do it. So, unlike the Dark Souls piece, and I know I mentioned this before, but I'll call to attention to it now. Unlike the, well, let's just admire the art first. I mean, it really is beautiful. So we've got this cool little robot here going around, gonna fight some people. Wonderful breakdown of how she modeled it, and also the UV pop out here, the UV mapping, and he said she did a wonderful job here, but these days computers do a lot of that for you. So I think he was being a little bit of an old curmudgeon there. Of course, I'm only joking, but he was impressed with the UV-ing and all that stuff. It looked great, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what you don't see in this portfolio piece is context. So Kelly really neglected to explain what the hell this is, right? Where are we going to use this robot? Is it going to be in a video game? Is it in some sort of, I don't know, short film rendering? I mean, of course it's a video game because she's making game art, right? But what size is it even? He didn't know what size the robot was. He said there is some ways that you can give context clues. For example, decals, handles, switches, nuts, bolts, latches. But there isn't really a lot of that going on here. In fact, almost none of that is included in this piece. And so it's really hard to contextualize how big it is. And so he said one thing that you could see is, and think back to those science diagrams where you've got the silhouette of a man next to the silhouette of the Tyrannosaurus Rex, so you can get an idea for just how big it is. Something like that would have been really useful here, or I think even better, grabbing a 3D environment and plopping the robot into that 3D environment. It would also be really useful if we could better understand what led you to this work. So we didn't review this part of the resume. Maybe there's more detail here. He didn't read this though. I just want to make note. Like he just jumped directly to this piece and was only reading these short blurbs. So of course, if you have more detail, put it here. And certainly we do need more detail on this piece. It's just not enough context to understand what it is you were even making here. Clearly it's a robot, but for what purpose? I think more detail needs to be made there because, of course, he's always thinking about it from the storyteller mindset. What's the purpose of this piece? What are we trying to tell? Is it a little toy, or is it a boss fight monster? All of this is incredibly relevant for determining where the level of detail needs to be and how this piece needs to be designed, for lack of a better term. So that's an overview. Let's jump a little bit into the details of this piece. Mecha in autopilot. So yeah, he wants to see, are you inspired by something? Want to see the key refs, want to see the influences, want to see what informed the form and function here. He's thinking, or he says to me, okay, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking it's a bipedal character. I'm thinking about the joints. I'm thinking about how they move, how they twist. And he's thinking about, this is a bit of a tangent, but let me tell you about one of the best haircuts I ever had. weird story. A lot of people don't know this, but I used to be a model for hair. Back when I used to dye my hair white. Yes, this is true. I used to have white hair like a little ghost or something like that. And I remember I was sitting down for this gig, and they had flown in this expert hairstylist from London, and he was helping to train the other stylists and doing a haircut, right? And he asked me some questions that I'll tell you I've never gotten from a barber before. Like asking, he just thought about the context of my hair. He said, I noticed you rode your bike over here. You probably wear your bike helmet a lot. I have to think about how that's going to, if you're taking that on and off, that's going to affect what sort of the stylizations we're going to do. It's going to affect, how much work do you want to put into your hair? Do you want to have to, style it every day? Do you want to be able to just pull off a helmet and then it works? He really thought about the context of the hair, more so than I think the normal barber would. And so I think I know it's a silly, strange story, but I think there's parallels there between this barber artistry and the work that we're doing here. We have to think about this robot and what role it plays within the story. So I don't know, it's sort of a silly example, but hopefully that's helpful. Okay, so he's the other thing he's thinking about with joints is clearance of motion. He's thinking, okay, can that arm twist around 360, 180? Is there enough room for it? And here is where he's thinking about opportunities for storytelling. Well, hey, well, maybe we'll get into that a little bit later, but screw it, we could jump into it now. All right, so he's thinking about how this robot's going to move. That's a really great opportunity for us to get into storytelling, because if a robot has moved, over time, you're going to get some clues for that, right? So what are some examples? Well, he talked about how we might have some colorization on the bottom of the robot, right? Maybe if it's been trucking through some grass, we're going to see some green stains on the armor to show, all the grass it's been walking through or something like that. Are certain parts of this armor replaced maybe, or well worn more so than others? In particular, maybe this robot, this was a lovely example. He was talking about how a robot might, twist its arm and maybe just scratch a little bit against the surface, right? If a robot scratches just a little bit against the surface over a few years, that might lead to these big scratches across the surface and to show the wear and tear. And Kelly doesn't really engage that level of detail on this piece, which I think is to the detriment of the piece. And it loses an opportunity to show master artistry in this piece. So there really isn't a lot of that. And it didn't make him very happy. So he was unhappy to see that when it came to roughness on this piece, it was, for lack of a better term, rather uniformly applied. You could see that this piece is kind of rough over here, just about as much as this piece over here is roughed up, just about as much as this piece over here is roughed up, here is roughed up. And so roughing up the piece is important, it's necessary, but to the extent that it's normalized and basically everything's just roughed up the equal amount, well, there's a lack of intentionality there. And I think that's not a good thing, because we're losing the opportunity to tell the story, to say, yeah, it's worn, but worn all over just about the same. It stood out as not great. So he didn't like that. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to start thinking about, there's so many things that you could do with a robot, right? Certainly a robot that's been around as long as this one apparently has. What is that going to look like? It just felt a little bit generic to him. And I don't think that's a good thing. But again, he said, let me concede, right? The context is super important here. Are we going to have 50 of them walking across the screen on a mobile RTS? Well, that's a hell of a context, right? It's going to certainly inform the level of detail we can go into this thing. Or is it something that in a 3D game like BioShock, maybe this is something like the Big Daddy, where you're going to walk up against it, it's going to be an enemy that you got to fight or something like that. Well, if that's the case, a lot more level of detail would be needed there in order to sell a real AAA level of detail, right? So these are some of the things that he's thinking about. I want to talk about the poly distribution, because he called out that Kelly did a fantastic job here. Really well done. This is beautifully modeled. and the poly distribution is very well thought through, is what he said. In particular, he thought that Kelly paid particularly good attention to spherical items, and which of course require a little bit more polys. And what else? Let's see here. And he also was really happy to see the UV organization, so he was happy you included this level of detail. He also thought that this was actually rather well designed. He would have appreciated on the maps. I think there's some maps that come up later. Yeah, so for these maps, they weren't big enough for him. So he would have appreciated if you took maybe your favorite map and just made it full screen so he could really see the detail here. Now, I'll be honest, as somebody who's not an artist, I don't really know what this roughness map even means. And I can't really look at it and be like, oh yeah, good detail. But if you show it to him, you know, he can really understand the reason to the music, the rhyme to the music there. So if you make it big, he would really appreciate that, because they do want to fine-tune look at that. He did spend a particular amount of time looking in the normal maps, because he said the normal maps are a place where associate, junior, new artists often get caught up. In particular, he mentioned, I forget the exact thing that he said. What was it called? I can't remember, but he's saying that you have some sort of a, maybe I'll find it. Scan. Yes, okay, so he said the normal maps were super clean. Oh, okay, actually, this was for the later piece, which we'll talk about later. All right, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. This is for the Star Wars droid. Let me finish one thing at a time. So the model execution and the surface execution, right? So in other words, he thinks about this piece in sort of two pieces. First is the model execution. So we're looking at this work here. It's sort of a big picture view. And then the other perspective is the surface execution. So he appreciated that you split it up into those two sections so that he could see both in great detail. Whereas I guess with the previous piece, you only showed the model execution. Procedural degradation looks compelling. Right, so he's saying, you know, a lot of this degradation here, it just looks procedural. And that's fine, but there's ways to use masking in a way that will inform the procedural generation. And so you might have a greater wear over here, greater wear and tear over here. And he was particularly called out to certain pieces that might not make sense for them to have wear and tear, right? So maybe this inlet over here, maybe it doesn't really make sense for something to be scratching up inside of that. So he's looking for that, you know, maybe inside here and inside here, you know, and he's trying to think about things that just wouldn't make as much sense. Also, you know, for all this wear and tear, I have to say the glass looks rather pristine. I'm not seeing any scratches at all, and this looks almost completely clear. So that's a little bit disharmonious, I guess is the term. Like, it's not quite fitting with the story. What else do we have here? So of course, you know, he wants to see a story here. What's the story of the degradation? You can't get that with random noise. He said the dimpling degradation is frankly just as appealing as an orange. So I feel like that was a little bit derogatory, but I think he's saying, you know, it doesn't look good. It's just bland and generic. In particular, the ground contact, right? He's talking about the feet should have much more degradation and wear and tear than the other upper half of the piece. Are they muddy? Are they stained green? All that stuff. All these details strike him as rather large and simplified. I think he's looking at the lighting. He's looking at the gun, the joints. Again, there's really no sense of scale, but this piece right now seems very mobile ready, but not equipped for AAA detail. And again, he wants indicators of scale. Nuts, bolts, warning symbols, decals, things like that. And we talked about the silhouette of a person for reference. Okay, fantastic. So that concludes the review of this piece. Fantastic job, Kelly. I think it looks great. And so hopefully some of those comments and criticisms can inform revisions on this piece or your next piece in your portfolio. Fantastic. And then the last one we went into some relative detail on was the droid, which is from Star Wars. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then he just had some brief notes on the other two pieces, which I think are not as strong relative to some of the other ones we've seen here. So let's talk about the droid from Star Wars. Uh, these pieces are getting progressively worse. Okay, the details are not coming through, right? And so we're looking at different things here, but yeah, everything sort of has a different story to tell. But I think some of the lessons that we learned in the previous pieces need to be applied here as well. What we're talking about is a Star Wars droid. Now, it's no secret that Star Wars is one of the best known franchises in the world. Oh, let me just check my OBS really quick. It's one of the best known franchises in the world. Instantly iconic. We know the movies. We know the comic books, the video games. He was thinking about the video game in particular. I know there was just a recent video game that came out with the Star Wars franchise. So he knows what these droids look like, right? He's seen them before. And he said that's a difficult thing to put into a portfolio. For one reason, it gives you the context instantly, which is kind of good. Here as well, Kelly neglected to include the context of this piece, so we really don't know where it fits in or what's it for. However, you're going to be compared with Star Wars level art, which is some of the best in the business, right? So in a sense, that can be tough shoes to fill. And I don't think Kelly lived up to that standard, unfortunately, on this piece. So here are some of the things that he mentioned. So he's a little aggravated because he knows it's a Star Wars piece, but it doesn't look super duper realistic. He was like, oh, is it stylized, or should it go right inside a film? Or is it part of like the movie? Like, would this be like a 3D, like a, to go inside one of the movies as like a virtual render or whatever? I don't know, CGI, whatever it's called. Or would this be in one of those video games, like the new video game that came out? He wasn't really sure. So even though you're saying Star Wars, you got to specify, with a brand as big as that, right? It can mean anything. So what kind of Star Wars, if you know what I mean, right? It's like the Marvel Avengers, right? They're in, goddamn, every single franchise you can imagine, right? Disney's crazy. So we need some key art. We need some references. We need to know where it's coming from, and we want to see that process from the beginning to the end. Did you sketch out what this thing was going to look like, or were you just taking an example photograph from the original piece? I know it could be probably pretty daunting if you were basing this piece off an existing one to put them side by side, because you're going to immediately see all the flaws. And that's what he said, he could just look this, what is this, BB-18 or whatever that name of the droid is? He could just look that up, and then immediately they're going to be compared against each other, which can be a hard thing as an associate, right? Because you're going against something that's, one of the best in the business. But, but even that's better than no context at all, I think, to some degree. So I don't know. There's a lot to consider there. The other thing is, he mentioned this, and I think it's something we've heard in portfolios before, but you want to show off pieces in your portfolio that are relevant to the work you're going to be doing, right? So is this similar to the studio that made the Star Wars piece? Is it at their standard? Is it of their stylization, or not so much? This is some of the details that he's thinking about. If you're applying to God of War, you're going to want to design art that looks like it goes in God of War. And I think that's probably assumed, but it's important to say nonetheless, especially for other viewers who might be listening. So one of the things that we're looking at here is the droid proportions. They're very well done. The grooves on the head, these grooves, these black lines, he said seem rather large. And if so large, he says, I would assume they're hollow, so I want to see inside them. Frankly, this large black lines on the sides and on the top here, they don't look good because they don't look hollow. They look solid. And he said that almost looks like some sort of toon shading, which is assumed to not be the intended appeal here. So that really did not fare well for this piece. Because I don't think anybody wants to hear that, because I think we are going for realism in this case. Variation in he says, variation in line width could really influence proportion here. I could see some distortion as well on the side walls of the droid head. The sphere body, excuse me, this, so he's talking about the lines here. He's saying it doesn't quite look so good. And I mean, you could see how pointy the sphere looks to some degree. So basically you could see how this sphere is kind of pointy on the sides, and so I think he's saying that is drawing his attention, or he's saying the sphere head specifically. So I guess he's looking at this thing, and he's saying that there's some distortion, so he doesn't like it. And he's saying that the sphere body probably should get a greater amount of detailing, but there's just so many details on the head. So I think he's actually looking at this piece, and he's saying that you have nice proportions, but the amount of detail that's going into the head is sort of outshining the amount of detail that's going into the bottom here. That's what he's saying. Okay, so back to the normal maps. He was really impressed again. I think Kelly does a really great job at this. Fantastic work. He's saying the normal maps are super clean, and the term I was thinking of before, he said there's no observable kinks or scallops, which is another phrase he used for this thing, which is apparently when, I mean, I don't know. I don't really know anything about normal mapping, but he said there was no kinks or scallops there, so I guess that's a good thing. He says that a lot of new folks, junior folks, will have those problems, but he thought your normal maps looked great, and he was very impressed with the mapping. So Kelly does a great job of that stuff. He said, definitely a lot of skill here and great growth potential, which I think is awesome to hear. The standard, basically, he's saying this portfolio. So he's sort of talking about this piece in general here. I think I just asked him, like, what are some of your overall thoughts now that you've seen two pieces? He said, basically this art is not at the level of an associate yet, but it could be at the level of a junior, which is, I think, an entry-level position that would come before associate. So he's saying it does have a lot of good experience, though. So, maybe if this candidate was hired, she might be able to basically come in at a junior level, but with a fast track to an associate. So she'd probably have to do some mentorship and practice a lot more. But if she's able to hone some of these skills and really nail those details that we've been talking about all the while, foresight, storytelling, all this stuff, then she could reach the junior level relatively fast. Oh, sorry, the associate level relatively fast. And she needs to find a great lead who can help her hone her talent and really study her craft. Okay, so that's really a summary of Kelly's work here. We touched briefly upon some of the other pieces, so he had maybe a note or two to say, so I'll just look at that quickly, just so that Kelly can benefit from that feedback. But I have to say, overall, I learned so much about reviewing this portfolio with this expert, Sam. I really got a lot out of it, and I'm so grateful that he lent his time and by proxy to all of us watching the video so that we can gain a better appreciation for the art and the tremendous amount of work and effort that I'm sure Kelly put into this work. And I mean, the pieces look awesome. I think it's some really incredible artistry on display here. And we're all excited about how she's going to grow from this piece, of course. Okay, it looks like my web is broken or something. Oh, here we go. Okay, cool. So we're going to jump into the Berserk Arm. Is that this thing? I think that's what he called it, the Berserk Arm. All right, so things are loading a little bit slow for me. So let's just say, I'll just read off his notes here. Berserk Arm was good, but he wanted to contextualize the piece so we know where it's from. Okay, so we've talked about that already, kind of. He says, what's up with the chipped arm? I don't tell which part has so much distressing. He says he's looking... Okay, so basically he's saying it's distressed all over, and this is this thing we see consistently with Kelly's work where, it does look sort of like a procedural stressing. I mean, looking at this desk, right? It's almost like this desk has been equally used all over. And I mean, I've seen some really cool modeling in the past. Maybe not modeling, but texturing might be the right terminology. Where, you can see that... I mean, I've seen this in real desks in real life. Just real life's one of the best examples, right? But somebody who sits at the same desk year over year, and I mean, look at this desk, man. It looks older than my grandpa. This desk probably should have a little bit more wear and tear near where somebody's sitting, where somebody's interacting with it, where they're pulling the handles. But again, we're seeing this in the mech piece where I touched upon it in great detail, but it's really, the same feedback as well in the table and the arm here is we just see sort of equal levels of wear and tear across the items, which is not good. ArtStation is undergoing maintenance. Is that what's going on? What the heck? Let's keep jumping in here. So this is a Resident Evil game. He says that the Resident Evil games are getting more and more detailed over time. And so, of course, he's thinking about the latest ones that came out. And he's saying that this level of detail just doesn't cut it. It's not up to the standard of AAA. He's saying, the distress, where's it going to be distressed? It's going to be distressed where it's used the most. But you got to watch out for inlets and inside corners where it might not make sense for it to be distressed. So that's something to think about. Okay, any other thoughts here? I mean, it's a desk, right? Somebody's using this thing every day, presumably. There's so many opportunities to tell a story here, and I think he was disappointed that more of those opportunities weren't seized. So the next thing he's saying is, hey, if you want to be an environment artist, then check it out. Out of your, damn it, this site looks like it's down. This is, of course, the unfortunate part of having your website or having a different website host your portfolio is it might go down for maintenance, whatever the hell that means, right? Imagine if this happened in the middle of your portfolio review. Well, shit, that would suck. That's why I always encourage my my students to just make a Weebly or something like that. I know ArtStation is pretty well known, but I don't know. If it works for you, it works for you. I guess it's probably a weird occurrence that this website's being laggy. But here's the thing. Kelly's got, 5 pieces here? She's an environment artist. How many of them are environments? Well, 1 out of 5. So that's not what he would like to see. He'd, of course, like to see more environments if you're an environment artist. And I'm sure, Kelly's new, maybe just out of school or still in school. She's building out her portfolio. There's a lot of time to grow and to practice that. But of course, we want to see more of that if that's your goal and that's where you want to focus. Any other things here? Okay, the other thing is not really related to the portfolio, but I asked, hey, if Kelly went into an interview, what is something that other things she might want to be able to speak to with respect to not just the art, but maybe considerations beyond that? And he said it might be useful to talk about scene performance and see if she is thinking about that kind of stuff. So again, we're talking about that second skill there. We had storytelling, but we also had foresight. So thinking about how does this piece work within a game? Is she thinking about performance? How performant is her work? What are the physics considerations of her pieces, and how it all works together? Thinking about when this thing gets animated or whatever happens to it, and thinking about how it fits into a game and how it's going to run at frame rate. So these are all the considerations which he made. Okay, cool. Well, there we go. Just about an hour exactly. A review of a wonderful portfolio. Thank you so much, Kelly, for sending it in. And of course, thank you anybody who's watching. I hope you learned a lot. And it's been an absolute pleasure of mine to provide this critique and feedback from an expert to anybody who's willing to listen. And I hope it benefits you as much as it benefited me, because I certainly learned a lot from looking at these pieces and sitting down with the expert to review them. Of course, if you have a portfolio which you'd like me to help review, I'd be happy to help you. Just send it my way, and I won't be able to sit down with an expert every time. I think this was a bit of a special occasion. But if there's any way I can help you on your journey to becoming a game developer, I want to support you. That's what I'm here to do. That's what this channel is all about. So good luck out there, and I'm excited to see what you folks make.